As I mentioned before, you are originally from Trinidad and Tobago.
Mhm.
Can you share an experience in your life when you became aware of white violence, kind of in the way that I've described this idea? And did your early life in Trinidad and Tobago kind of give you an awareness of this?
Okay, a couple things. First of all, you can just call me Daria. Daria
Okay,
is my first name, but most
pleasure.
people just shorten it to Daria.
Okay.
Um, and Domima, it's that first donor. That's Dominique Martino, my sister, um,
Oh, okay.
who's standing in the comments right now. Um, so yeah, I think it's interesting the way you talk about violence. I do want to first address that definition. I think that it's important to also note that not all violence is physical. Um, I mean, sometimes it comes in the form of a threat, a threat of physical violence, and sometimes it can be something like using a slur. To me, that's an act of violence.
Okay.
So I think that in Trinidad and Tobago, growing up, racism, and we've talked about this a lot actually in the last few weeks of reckoning, is that a lot of times what we saw was racism was more covert and kind of coded into and and colorism. So for anybody unfamiliar with that term, kind of discrimination within communities of color, of privileging lighter skin over darker skin, which happens in a lot of Black and Asian communities, especially, and Latinx communities as well. So I think that's where I saw a lot of it happening in terms of just racism and prejudice and discrimination, which all can lead to a certain diminishing of a person and traumatizing of a person, even if you're not doing them physical harm. In terms of physical violence, I think what you see in Trinidad a lot is the treatment of people in poorer communities by police. Um, and the thing is, people don't necessarily recognize it as racism because even though those communities are largely Black, you also see a lot of Black people. Like, I grew up upper middle class, you see a lot of Black people who do that. So they're kind of saying, oh, this isn't about race, this is about them behaving like animals and the police doing their job. And that in and of itself is partly an internalized anti-Blackness and also just an idea of people not recognizing the systems and the colonialism that led to that place of violence. And as you mentioned very aptly, white violence doesn't necessarily have to be perpetuated by white people. It's often just things that we enact within our own community in Trinidad as a largely Black and brown society, where we are perpetuating the things that happened to us with colonialism. So for instance, when I was about 12 years old, I think they banned corporal punishment in school. Up to that point, it was perfectly okay for your teacher to spank you, to hit you with a ruler, to do all these things. And we have to think about where that comes from. That's a relic of slavery. That's a relic of colonialism. So why are we still doing that? You know? So that's kind of my take on violence. And I don't think I realized until I was an adult that these were kind of remnants of white supremacist thinking and tactics to kind of keep Black people, Indian people, Chinese people, people of color in their place, so to speak.
Sure, sure. And thank you for sharing that experience with us. I think it's really interesting the comment you made about how this happened to you as a child, but it wasn't until you became an adult that you were able to really kind of see it for what it was. And I think that so much of what this racist system does is that it indoctrinates people at such a young age into a certain way of thinking and behaving that you don't necessarily question it until you're old enough to really have the capacity to question it and to understand it. And by then, for so many people, it's too late because it's now who you are, and it's much more difficult to kind of erase those behaviors. So I definitely appreciate you sharing that with us.